Okay, sorry about that. When a bear was killed and its skin was off, Omakayas knew it looked fearfully like a person. She also heard the bears laugh and cry just as humans do. Grandma once seen a bear rocking its young in her arms just like a human mother rocks its young. Nobody on the island ever tossed the bones of a bear aside. Every bear bone was gathered respectfully and buried, all together. At a bear feast, the bear skull was ribboned and set out on a good red cloth, spoken to, honored. Yes, there was something about what had happened that made Omakais very quiet. As she scraped at the hide, nicking bits of meat and gristle from the surface, she began to get all empty and peculiar and faint inside. A thought was coming. A voice approached. This happened to her sometimes. A dizzy feeling would pass over her, and if she attended to it closely, once it was gone, she would know something a little extra, as though she'd overheard two spirits talking. She kept scraping, gritting her teeth, and held on to her thoughts, for once again she could feel the presence of the powerful mother bear at her shoulder. Although there were no words, and although there was no odor of her presence, no bear sounds, no tracks, Omakaias' heart lightened. Turning from her work, she knew the bear had visited her. She knew the bear had followed her home. She knew that when she needed the bear, she would be able to call on the bear. The bear had understood something she had said, and she had understood something the bear had thought. And although she couldn't tell exactly what, Omakaias turned back to her task with her head clear and her hands cheerful. So this is the task she's tending to. This is the scraping of the moose hide. So she's scraping the bits and pieces of flesh left on it. She worked so hard all through that afternoon that her grandma, watching her keenly, made a great fuss over the work Omakaias had done on the hide. She said Omakaias had done as well as a full-grown woman. Her mother promised her a very special pair of winter moccasins. Angeline even braided her hair with one of her own red ribbons. Niwu means fourth. And that was what they called the baby. But soon, Grandma said the baby would have to have a name. The tiny boy was a spirit, so far, who had come to live here and was deciding whether or not to stay. Grandma told Omakaias to be careful with him, little baby Niwu, because he might decide to go back to the other place if he thought his big sister was mean. So Omakaias was very gentle with the baby. She rocked him in the branch-held Tinkenagon with great consideration. She gathered spongy moss and old oak punk to stuff in the cradle board and use as a diaper. She twirled and dangled the little web of sinew and the tobacco ties and bitten birch bark pretties that Grandma tied onto the head guard of the Tinkenagon. She fed Niwu tiny bits of the best food when Mama wasn't looking. She felt in her heart streams of love for the baby pouring through, and she begged her mother to let her take Niwu out and cart him to the lake on her hip. But her mother smiled and touched Omakaias' hair gently and shook her head. Gaween! No, she was too young. Grandma gave her the willow doll instead. Told her to let the baby sleep. Directed her to play with little Pinch. But she knew what that would mean. Pinch would jump on her back and yell, Nadai! Get moving! He would pull her braids. He would use her as a practice bow and arrow target. He would tip over the rock children and rock people she made of specially piled lake pebbles. He would destroy her rock people village down to the beach. No, she didn't want to play with him. Little Pinch, never. Yeah, this guy sounds like a fun guy. Not. Half the summer went by quickly after the visit from the bear. Omakaias stayed thoughtful. She helped hoe the corn patch almost every day and never complained. She was kind, hard-working, patient, but she was also lost in her own thoughts. She startled when spoken to, went to sleep early, and slept long. Dreamed hard, but couldn't remember the night's adventures. And she had also had those dizzy moments that her grandmother said meant she was special to the spirits. One day her mother said to her grandmother, if she wasn't so young, I'd give her the charcoal. Grandma's deep and far-seeing eyes took in Omakayas. She seemed to see her granddaughter from the inside out. She watched Omakayas for a long time and then shook her head. No, not yet. When a mother put charcoal on her child's face, it was a sign that the child was ready to starve for a vision, for power. A child with a blackened face didn't eat for days, and sometimes lived out in the woods alone until the spirits took pity on him or her and helped out with a special vision, a special visit, some information. But Omakayas was too young, according to Grandma. So Mama stirred the fire and worried. She had a lot to think about anyway, including a name for baby Niwu, who was getting restless, trying to crawl out of the cradle board, acting as though he was anxious, actually as though he were anxious to have that name. There were 7 or 8 people on the island who possessed the right to give names. Auntie Muskrat was one. Day Thunder, Swan, Old Man Migwans, and an ancient lady named Wabakanaway knew how to dream names, but Mama had asked, and each of them had tried, but not one of them yet dreamed about a name for Niwu. For some reason, said Auntie Muskrat, that dream won't come. She even slept and fasted in the woods for a name, but the spirits were stubborn. Old Wabanakaway, who dreamed many names, had no name for the baby either. But she said she would give no other name until she found one for the boy. She searched her dreams. Meantime, baby Niwu grew. Omakayas decided in secret that the naming was up to her. In play, just when the two of them were together, she gave her little brother names. Bird names. Chickadee, she called him. Apichi, Robin, Little Junco, Sparrow, Grouse Chick. He seemed to like all of his bird names, and when he heard them, he grinned and he waved his chubby arms in delight. Omakayas could hardly resist Niwu and played with him as often as she was allowed. There was something about the way he looked at her so sadly with big soft eyes that made her want to cuddle him tight in her arms, and there was something about the way that he smiled when she made a face, surprised, so grateful, that made her kiss and touch his hair with great passion and indignation in her heart. He should have a name, and clearly he wanted out of his Tinkanagun. All right, what's a Tinkanagun? All right, let's check it out. A Tinkanagun, if you look in our glossary in the back, is a cradle board made of lightweight wood with a footrest on one end and a bow-shaped frame at the other. A baby is wrapped snugly into the Tinkanagun with cloth, blankets, and skins. The Tinkanagun can be carried on the mother's back, leaned against a tree or a wall, and safely hung from a tree branch. Small toys such as shells, dream catchers, or pieces of birch bark with bitten designs are often hung from the bow-shaped frame where the baby's head is to amuse him or her. Aha! Omakayas wanted to help him to freedom. Her chance came. One morning later in the summer, Omakayas' mother, sister, grandma, and little Pinch all wanted to go into the village and see the big canoes that had arrived to unload furs at the traders. Omakayas' father, Mikwam, wasn't with these voyageurs, but Mamma hoped they might have news of him. The thought itself made Mamma so anxious that she got ready to go off in haste, though baby Niwu was still sleeping. "Why don't you leave Niwu with me?" Omakayas asked at the last moment. "I don't want to go. I can take care of him. You'll get there faster." She saw Mamma's thoughts falter. "You don't want to go?" "I don't." Angeline and Grandma were already halfway down the path. Little Pinch was tugging on Mamma's legging, whining for something to eat. "All right," Mamma decided. "We'll be right back. Now don't do anything. Just rock him, Omakayas, and play with him. If he wakes up, don't do anything." "Well, of course not," said Omakayas, trying hard not to show how excited she was to have her baby brother, Niwu, all to herself. She made herself tall and acted as grown up as possible, rocked him with one hand gently, while she waved goodbye to Mamma and kept rocking long after her mother rounded the corner and disappeared into the ferny forest growth. She didn't wake, or he didn't wake. She quit rocking, just stared at his slumbering face. His lashes were so long and stiff, his little chin so chubby, she wanted to stroke it. The skin on his cheeks so fine and delicate and soft she could hardly keep from brushing her lips across them. Tufts of silken hair stood out all over his head, and his breath was still sweet with milk. She touched him, very gently. "Baby Niwu." "Chickadee," the name popped into her mind. "Today I'll call you Chickadee," she said. His eyes opened, and as though he understood. His look was bright and filled with secret jokes. He gazed up into her face. For a long time they looked at one another. It was perfect. It was love. And then his face crumpled. One fat tear squeezed from his eye. His lower lip shook. Suddenly his mouth flew open and he bawled. Omakayas was so close, so dreamy and happy that the force of it nearly flipped her back head over heels. His squall was like a whirlwind, like a sudden wash of freezing spray, like a harsh wind, weather, like a hot wall of sound. "Shh, shh, shh," Omakayas rocked and muttered, shushed, hummed, and sang an old lullaby her mother used. Nothing worked. Baby Niwu screamed louder with increasing force. Omakayas was alarmed. She'd never heard him scream like this, had she? What was wrong? Was it a biting fly, a spider, a tick, bee, something stinging or biting him inside the tight binding of his Tinkanagun? Only one way to find out. Unbind him, and that was forbidden. Still, as Niwu's miserable and now hysterical sobbing continued and got even stronger, she decided to make a grown-up decision and take Niwu from his cradle board. So she did. She undid the twist of vine that held him inside the braided velvet wrapping. She carefully untied and spread the embroidered wrapping, then took out his diaper moss, and brushed him off like a root pulled from the ground. He was naked, of course, but it was a warm day, and she lifted him immediately into her arms, still weeping, and brought him to a sunny place just beyond the house, behind the trees, out near the water. Omakayas suddenly realized that Niwu had quieted. Her ears were still ringing with the sounds of his cries. Seagulls wailed. A skinny shorebird ran up and down the sand, busily pecking. Niwu brandished his chubby fists, blithered at the water, blasted spit excitingly at the sparkling waves, and turned his melting and mischief-filled eyes upon his sister to tell her that she was the most wonderful human on earth. She settled him beside her on a warm stretch of rock, put a stick in his hand. He looked at the stick, tested it between his gums, and he had one pitiful little tooth he was very proud of, and he tried to use it to bite the stick. The stick was too strong for Niwu. He banged it purposefully at the little circles of green lichen scattered on the stone surface. When the stick broke in two, he yelled in sheer joy and continued beating the rock with the short end of it. Omakayas was so happy that she laughed out loud. "You'll be a drummer, a singer. I'll dance for you," she said, although it was wrong of her to have set Niwu free. It was very obvious that he had always wanted to be banging his stick on a rock and feeling the warm sun on his face. So they sat together for a good while longer. Omakayas tossed stones into the water, sending up splashes to surprise her little brother, and in turn seemed to try and talk to her in serious burps and babbles about what it was like to be a baby packed in a carrier, hanging on a branch all day long, never allowed to throw rocks or stuff leaves in his mouth. Omakayas thought she heard him tell her this was the best day of his life so far. She thought she heard him tell her that she was his very favorite sister and he liked her much, much better than Angeline. He definitely said to her that he would never forget this and that when they were very old he would stare at her the way he was doing now and laugh, and they both would be toothless then. "But I'll have to put you back now or else I'll get in trouble," Omakayas said regretfully. She lifted him into her arms, a delicious baby weight, and carried him jouncing back to the clearing and the house, and laid him back into his wrappings and began to lace him in. His face crumpled in betrayal and opened his mouth. Quickly, Omakayas reached into her pocket. The remains of the treat from Old Tallow was still there. She popped the last bit of the lump of maple sugar onto his tongue. His mouth closed. A look of blissful surprise came over his face. His body relaxed. Oh, good. Giving a baby sugar. Nothing bad can happen there, right? His body relaxed. And by the time Omakayas had him laced back into the Tinkanagun, his eyelids were drooping, and by the time her mother came home with no news of her father, but with a bit of brilliant red cloth, 4 brass buttons, and 6 thimbles for which she traded a load of dried fish, Omakayas was rocking Niwu as though she'd been doing so all along, and her little brother was smiling in sleep. The month of picking berries went by. Picking heartberries, went by. Little Pinch jumped off a low branch and made a huge gash just over his eye. Blood came pouring down, and he seemed both proud of himself and sorry for himself, and he selfishly hogged attention for his injury to the point where Omakayas could hardly bear it. Mama was constantly preoccupied with him. Of course, that left Niwu more and more to Omakayas' hands, and she didn't mind that. After the hours they spent in freedom, it always seemed to Omakayas that she and her little brother exchanged a secret knowledge in their smiles. Grandma began to call Little Pinch by a new name, Big Pinch, because he grabbed handfuls of food and tried to stuff his face. He was very slow learning manners. It was hard to teach him. He had an eager, greedy, pushing nature. Omakayas liked him less with every day that passed, and wished desperately that someone, Old Tallow or Auntie Muskrat, perhaps, would ask Mama if they could keep him. When he got on her nerves the worst, she imagined and dreamed maybe someone who'd lost a son would ask for Pinch, or maybe their father, Miquam, would arrive and say he needed an always hungry little boy of 5 winters to accompany him on his next long trip. The missionaries, they might want to use Pinch as an example. But of what? Things not to do? He could live underneath the church. Something, anything, just a little relief. He was so annoying to Omakayas that she found herself occasionally wishing a dreadful wish that an eagle or an old grandfather owl might snatch him up and carry him to a high nest. She always stopped herself when her heart grew dark, but oh, those wishes were satisfying. It was a cool, dark summer night in the first days of the blueberry picking time, and Omachias had just fallen asleep when something made her awaken, a dream or a sound. She lay quiet with her eyes just a tiny bit open, staring confusedly at the soft flames that occasionally flickered up among the coals that glowed in the fire pit. Omachias raised her head drowsy, and Grandma was wedged into a thick bearskin beside the door, snoring lightly, and Big Pinch was tumbled at her feet. Angeline was tucked neatly into her blanket on the other side of the door. Suddenly, a shiver of happiness and excitement ran down through Omachias so strongly she feared she might cry out and wake everyone. Her heart jumped. She nearly threw off her robes to dance. Day-Day, her father, was home. There at the entrance, just barely lighted, her father's moccasins were heaped with Mama's. His were worn, though, dirty, beaten up, although not missing a single bead of Mama's tight beadwork. Mama's on the either side were spruce and neat. They were her fancy ones, trimmed at the ankle with a specially prepared ruff of white rabbit fur. Her mother's and father's moccasins always had a certain way of turning toward each other. Omachias thought Day-Day's moccasins were carefully made by Mama, and sometimes worn to shreds before he got home. Soft and open, they seemed relieved to flop inside the door and nestle into the safe embrace of Mama's pair. Her moccasins protected Day-Day's used-up ones, nuzzled them together, and seemed to be watching over and soothing away the many dangers of his footsteps. Drifting back into sleep, Omachias knew that by the time she woke, her mother would be cutting out a new pair of moccasins from the special moose hide she herself had tanned and smoked when the heartberries were first ripening. The thought brought her back to the memory of the bear mother as she fell back into her dreams. She wondered, would she tell her father what had happened? Would she ever tell anyone? Once more, she decided that she would keep the encounter to herself. Not only would she be scolded, but maybe even laughed at for playing with the bear cubs, but she was quite certain that no one else would understand. Omachias curled even deeper into her blanket, smiling in delight. She buried her face in the warm fur and fell at last into a heavy, dreamless sleep, knowing when she woke there would be Father, tall, bold, and strong, and joking to swing her high in the air. Mama would laugh even more than usual, and Angeline, too, shy and excited. There would be gifts, new things, special food. Grandma would look mightily for a feast. Mama would sew on her father's moccasins. Uncles would come visiting, cousins, relatives, to feast and listen to stories and tease endlessly. Baby Niwa would beg with his eyes for Day-Day's songs, and Big Pinch would have to be good. It's the end of chapter 3.